welcome to Pixel Politics, the podcast. Episode 2, the podcast that brings together politics and video games in a unique, new and positive way. I just want to first start by saying thank you for the support for the first episode. It's been really, really great. I've been advertising it and everyone's shown so much love for it, and it's been really, really good. And that's why we continue sort of the pilot project to get the podcast going. So for our second guest, I'm happy and super happy to welcome Alfie Bown, who's a lecturer in digital media, culture and technology at Royal Holloway. Thank you, Alfie, for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jack. Lovely to see you doing the podcast. It was fun to listen to the first one.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I was a bit nervous starting off, just like I am now, a tiny bit. But once you get it going, you start these ideas. They kind of turn into something great. And when you see your ideas on paper, it's fantastic.
No, it's very good. I'm looking forward to seeing what it does. It's great. Also, it's great that people are connecting video games and politics, which I think there's a massive need to do that more. You sound like you're from London as well, are you?
I'm from Brighton.
Oh, Brighton.
But then this is the thing with Brighton and Londoners. It's sort of that mix, right? So when you're in Brighton, there's a lot of Londoners who come down, and then there's a lot of Brighton people go up to London, and the accent sort of like merges a tiny bit.
Merged in, yeah. Your accent is not too dissimilar. I'm from London myself, so.
Okay, fair enough. I wanted to first ask you, as a lecturer, so you've got research interests in psychoanalysis, digital media, critical theory, and video games, and I can assume that you teach and lecture on a lot of that. As a lecturer, how have you found the sort of online Zoom and the Skype? Has that been trickier? Because I'm a student myself at the moment, and it's been a bit strange. How have you found that?
I mean, I'm still young enough that it's almost second nature to me. So compared to some of my colleagues who've struggled along a little bit more, it's been all right for me. Okay, sure, it's not as good as it could be. It's actually, to be honest, I do teach sort of philosophy and digital media and things like that, which translates, it'd be nicer to be in person, but you can do it online just the same, because you're just a bunch of people talking. But some of the stuff we do, I also teach video game art and design, and some of that stuff's a bit more practical, and you miss out a lot. You want to be in the lab with the hardware and playing around with the stuff in person. It's not the same remotely. So it's not as good, but it's what we got, so crack on.
So you design software, or you've worked in designing software before?
I'm not particularly talented, to be honest, when it comes to coding. I'm much more of a philosophy and writer and a philosopher type. I do some elements of like very simple coding and things around like making interactive video, things like that, games in programs like Twine and little rubbish kind of I do storytelling for games, basically. So most of it's creative writing, storyboarding, planning, things like that. But there's some technical elements as well in just some game software. And I work with colleagues who are much more skilled than me in game engines and game design. And collaboratively, we make stuff.
That's really interesting. I've always been interested in getting into creative design myself, and creative writing, because they offer so much opportunity to not just improve your writing, but if you enjoy what you do and you enjoy video games, you can kind of like go into that field as well. So I've always been super interested.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I did my I've always been a gamer, and then I did my degrees in sort of literature and philosophy and stuff like that. So I've been a sort of writing theory, philosophy person. And it was only really 5 or 6 years ago that I actually realised, I didn't have to write about books. I could actually write about games. And I sort of started to move across to the games industry and media studies and video games. And I've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years now, of sort of all areas of writing for games and studying games as well.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. And I've read a lot of your work, and it's been super interesting me to read some of it, because I've always been interested in how can I link that academic sort of source material to video games itself. And haven't read a lot of your work, and I saw a recent piece on The Guardian, not recent, but a couple of years ago on The Guardian, about how right-wing politics in video games can influence us through our desires, which is very interesting, because it seems like what you're suggesting is that because you're controlling the game itself, the game kind of puts its desires onto us.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean this. So I guess there's a few answers to this. First, this is an article which is more infamous than famous, and they got into a lot of trouble with all aspects of the gaming community, from the kind of Twitter gaming left right through to the kind of the kind of 4chan bros and the gamer communities around that time that were very upset with this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of the problem was, and I think that some of what I was saying was interesting and right, and some of it was probably not as thought through as I would like it to be now. But my basic interest is because I think people probably just thought I was another journalist having a go at games, whereas I've been a gamer since my 7th birthday when I got my Sega Game Gear, and I've played games every day since. So I'm a massive pro games person, not somebody who criticizes games. But for me, like I said, I was working on other things. I was working on. I'm very interested in psychoanalysis, and as you say, this is a question of desire, and how we. How like things from our society and culture and digital technologies and video games might influence our things like that, our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions and our desires. And it was actually around Gamergate in 2014 where obviously all this stuff sparked up about politics and games, and which is what made me think actually games could be I could spend the rest of my career if I wanted to. There'd be enough to do there, studying games and thinking about games. They're incredibly political things, which obviously enrages people on the left, the liberals on the right. And I think since 2014, that was actually quite a new thing. Most people thought games were apolitical, had nothing to do with politics at that point. But since Gamergate, I think games have been a very contentious site of politics. And, I think that there's a lot to be said here and thought about in terms of what is the politics of games? How do they affect us? How do they make us think, feel? Are games, and people on the right claiming that games are the ally of the left, and people on the left thinking of games as the ally of the nationalist right. And so it's this very sort of murky and contentious field, and obviously there's so many different angles to it. But obviously that is basically what my career in writing about games has been about, really, just trying to dig into sort of what the relationship between politics and games is, and how might we affect that or change it going forward for the better, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of, when I was reading your articles, what stood out to me was when you mentioned, for example, there's some games, especially post-Brexit, that have sort of empire building elements. And so you're talking about that sort of nostalgic feel for empire, that sort of isolationist approach of us and then them, and keeping away from the international community, which Brexit, in some ways it has, or the consequence of that. And you can see that in the games. And that's a really interesting comparison. And you also mentioned, for example, during the Bush years in the US, there was a lot of games that kind of took sort of foreign policy approaches and sort of analyzed foreign policy in their story. Is that a common trend you see or you've seen throughout games in terms of politics?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. I'll answer it, but first I want to say that I think that there are three ways in which games and politics are connected, and they're three quite different conversations, and maybe we'll talk about them, but maybe not. But like, one is the games themselves. Right, what politics does the game have within it, and what politics does it agree with the player to have? Like, does it encourage the player to have? Right, that's sort of category one. And then the second category would be the communities around games, which is quite a different question. How communities gather online and inside game engines and share politics through these gaming communities. That connects to 4chan, Reddit, Twitch, and this kind of like outside the game itself. There's these kind of political communities that are amassing around games. And that's a very different conversation, I think. And then the third one is the hardware issue, and like the fact that our PlayStations are made from pieces of tin and metal and various minerals, and various parts which are made at Foxconn's factories, and there's a whole kind of supply chain and global capitalism inside the very hardware of the games. So there's lots of different ways that games are connected to politics, and when we turn on our PlayStation and get hold of our controller and start playing something, or a Nintendo Switch that you've got behind you there, I'm playing my Nintendo Switch today as well, actually.
In the lecture, or
I sometimes have a cheeky little kind of lecture, in a meeting, like a little secret go. No. that's only one type of politics in games, right? The one that we actually see in the game itself. There's so much wider politics going on with the industry. But in terms of your question then, which is about the games themselves, yeah, absolutely, this is a pattern and a trend, and it's always been there. And it's a complete nonsense that there are still people who think that games are apolitical and nothing to do with politics. When the Division 2 came out a couple of years ago, Ubisoft CEO said this has got nothing to do with politics at all. It's obviously a complicated metaphor for dystopian American political life today, and there's no, whether they intended it to be or not, it is. And so there's this kind of idea that games are a bit of fun or escapism or should be separate from politics, which is still a prominent idea in games. And it's never been the case. As you said, you can think about the Bush years, you can think about post 9/11. Lots of good research has been done on how stereotypes and basically, frankly, racist American imperialist portrayals of the Middle East emerge after 9/11. We can even look at Space Invaders. I know that's a Japanese game, but things like Berserk, 80s arcade games, they reflect a tension with Russia. This is obvious. You know, they're space race games. They're, you know, and then again today, like I was, you know, like I said, even Brexit, we can think about, okay, how on a subtle way has our increasingly divisionist nationalist politics influenced the kind of games we might play and think. So games have always been a reflection of the politics of the place where they emerge from. Right. And if that place is imperialist and nationalist, then we're going to see those trends coming through into the video games that are produced in those contexts. If they are, if they come from a neoliberal sort of woke liberalism context, we're going to see those trends reflected in the games that we play. For example, in the new Watch Dogs Legion or something. So yeah, games reflect the economic and social conditions that we're in, and they emerge from those conditions. So every game is political, I think, from Mario to Sonic to something complicated and intricate like Detroit Become Human or Watch Dogs Legion or whatever it is you're looking at. The games have always been political, and I think we just need to take that as a starting point and then start thinking about, okay, what politics would we like them to have?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I think what's surprising to me is the fact that because a lot of the media, especially in video games, not just the media, but the communities in the industry are quite, I'd say, sort of left wing, and it's surprising that people haven't picked up on this, and they haven't picked up on how politics can have an impact within the games itself. I don't think a lot of people don't like to recognize that politics has this influence and impact when it actually does. Is there a reason for this? Is it because it's very sensitive, it's taboo?
Well, no, I think it's so much more comforting to think that there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. I mean, and listen, I mean, I want to be clear that, like, I mean, okay, I do like it when games push interesting political agendas. I love a company like Mole Industria. It's Paolo Pedicini's company who does like democratic socialism simulator, things like that. And I like things like, obviously, famous examples like Papers, Please, you know, which are politically engaged games, which directly, they're still fun and entertaining, but they push a political idea of some kind. I love that stuff. But you know, I'm not saying we should only be playing that kind of thing and not GTA or whatever it is we enjoy playing. And I think people think that when you start saying games are political, you're being critical. You're saying that you shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing that. You know, and like you said about your podcast, you know, politics doesn't make it. The fact that they're political makes it more fun and more interesting, and also it makes it more important. Like, I don't want to think of games as, look, obviously books are political, right? Obviously films are political. So they influence us, right? No one would say that, you know, the Hollywood industry is not political. It's transformed our world over the last 50 years. It's transformed how people think, how people see relationships, how people see war, how people see everything. It's incredibly influential. If you think that games aren't political or claim they aren't, then you're basically saying it doesn't matter. You know, and it does matter. Games are the most important thing. And this is another thing that I think is really important. You know, games have taken over, not just in the numbers in terms of being a bigger money-making industry than films, but they've taken over as the dominant way in which, you know, we grow up and we live. We're gaming every day. And of course, these are incredible. And I love games and I want them to be influential and important. And they are. They're changing how we think, how we feel, how we relate to each other. And for me, that's an exciting and positive thing. You know, it also makes them dangerous. If you've got a game which is just pure American imperialism, you know, clearly there's a concern here because people are going to young people are going to grow up internalizing views that are American imperialist. It's obvious that that'll happen.
Yeah.
But thankfully, the games industry is really interesting and diverse, and there's loads of interesting and different ideas in the gaming industry. And so I think it's just time we kind of admitted that and started thinking about it as a positive thing. I don't understand really the argument that games should be kept separate from politics. And to be honest, it's also a point from psychoanalysis that nothing is separate from politics. I mean, the back of your cereal box is not entirely separate from politics. So, there's no way video games are.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it can have a positive impact. Definitely.
Yeah.
That's what the whole channel's about. Like, Pixel Politics, it's a channel that seeks to do that. It's proving how politics can have a good impact. And your studies really play a part in helping to prove that, whichever way that is. And I've also was super interested in how you started to talk about sort of progressive politics, and from your articles you've talked about sort of right-wing politics and how it's having an impact. Is the solution progressiveness and sort of putting progressiveness in games so that the desires actually become progressive?
Yeah, that's ultimately what I'd like to see, but I think it has to be qualified by saying that, like you said, a lot of people consider the games industry to be dominated by the political left. I think that is not correct. I think that the game industry is dominated by liberal attitudes, and this is where you might need a distinction. I mean, I personally, I'm somebody who considers myself politically quite to the left, or whatever, if that's even a useful set of terminology. But right now we're obviously living in quite a sort of woke liberal form of capitalism, and what we're seeing, for example, is a lot of games celebrating those values. I don't think games on the whole are American imperialist ideology anymore. That's something that games have historically been. Games now tend to embody and support kind of diversity and even rebellion, things like that. They tend to be a bit much more liberal. But there's a lot of issues here. That doesn't mean they're progressive, because this is ultimately it's relevant, for example, to contextualize that this is a post-Trump moment in terms of a kind of return to Biden's more traditional neoliberal capitalism in America, and it's a post-Corbyn moment over here, where a kind of rising left has been pushed out again by more kind of centrism, which represented by Keir Starmer for UK listeners. So we're actually a moment where the kind of extreme edges, the right and left, seem to be pressed out in favour of a kind of return to the neoliberal centrist values that have been politically dominant. And I think that's what we're seeing in video games. We're seeing them embody those kind of views. So I'd like games to do more than that and be more, not just come in line with, I think what's happening now, I guess to put it in one sentence, video games have admitted to a certain extent that they're political. And they're coming in line with the dominant discourse politically. So you see in things like Watch Dogs Legion, which I mentioned, I'm actually in it. I shouldn't be slagging it off so much because I'm in it.
Are you actually?
Yeah, if you turn to the talk radio station while you're driving around in Watch Dogs Legion, you can hear me saying this sort of thing that I'm talking to you about.
How did that come about?
The guys who were doing the podcast for Ubisoft just reached out, I guess, on the basis they collected a few sort of, it's interesting in our conversation because, like I said about Division 2, I think that's 2018, where the Ubisoft CEO said that this is an apolitical game. Admittedly, I think Watch Dogs is a Toronto Ubisoft, which may have differences to the others, but nevertheless, it represents a change, I think, because they had 5 to 10 journalists, academics, sort of games theory people actually involved in making the game, and we did recordings of ourselves talking about games and politics, and then that's actually something you can listen to in the game. So clearly there has been a shift even in the last couple of years within one company where we're no longer saying games have nothing to do with politics. We're sort of taking a direct approach and bringing politics into it, which I loved that. And I was free to say what I thought, and they used my points, and I was very pleased with that. But nevertheless, I think that what we're seeing with games like that is they're not being politically experimental. They're not pushing a progressive political agenda. They're more just like coming in line with what the dominant political views of this moment are. So I think there could be a lot more opportunity and scope for games to do more than that, and actually become a space for experimenting with new political ideas and stuff. And the other thing is, and this is a point which I've got from a friend and colleague of mine, Marianne Dij-Galvete, who's a kind of games activist and a kind of, and she's done a lot of work on, like I mentioned to you, this other kind of issue of the actual console itself, where basically there's no use having a woke feminist game where you play as a fantastic, empowered protagonist female character with racial diversity celebrated and so on, if every single component of the hardware and software was produced by underpaid Chinese workers in a factory who are almost all women and young girls. So there's a kind of disingenuousness and hypocrisy in the video games industry, as there is with Nike, doing their adverts that celebrate diversity and things, but yet continuing to kind of exploit through the structure of their industry and stuff. So, we've got a bit of a problem with video games sort of becoming more political, but actually getting a load of praise for being political while they still continue to support really exploitative supply chains and global structures underneath all that.
Definitely, and you can see that with the new consoles.
Absolutely.
They've got a lot of hardware built into them, but they're very, very cheap. And actually, the console developers, or PlayStation or Xbox, the big brands behind the consoles themselves, actually are losing money on them, which shows how cheap they actually are. And you're right, there's sort of a hypocrisy there. It's being hypocritical about where they actually come from. And
yeah.
And
when you were asking me about teaching on Zoom, one of the things we luckily we just did it before the latest lockdown, because one of my favorite things we do in our video games degree on my courses is basically we get old consoles, like I don't know, just I've got loads of like old consoles that don't work, like Dreamcasts and SNES and a NES and an Atari and things like that, and just get like a screwdriver and open them all up and look for like see if there's any like company names and stuff inside the like pieces of like plastic that are inside there, or any information about how it got produced. And it's amazing because you just see that this is so embedded in global capitalism and global patterns. Like there's parts made by Motorola, there's parts made at Foxconn, there's parts made here, there, the other places, and this is something that it's really difficult for video games to overcome, because it's you want an ethical gaming console that's not embedded in those things, but obviously that's you're talking about overthrowing capitalism to make that happen, maybe. But I mean one thing though I do think that's my feeling, I don't know if you agree, but people have been saying to me a lot recently, are you getting a PS5? And I can't be bothered. I don't really want one. I like I said, I still, and I have got the latest stuff, I have got a PS4 and a Switch and stuff, but like those, like a new GTA with even better graphics, or a new FIFA with even better graphics, like, is that really exciting and fun? I don't think it is. I'm much more inclined to play indie games, and these games are developed much cheaper, much more independently, and they're much less exploitative of these global patterns. Of course, they still are, because ultimately they're still played on some of the same consoles and computers. But we could move back a bit from just pushing the graphics and more and more power, and use more open access software, more indie game software, to take things back a few decades, but with all the kind of creative, you've seen things like Undertale, which can be made by one person with a pretty affordable and easy to access engine and things like that. Like the scope for us to make games, you're still going to be using computers that are complicit in capitalism, of course you are, but less so than the next console, the next sequel, the next kind of
Definitely. I mean, Undertale, fantastic game. The soundtrack is just outstanding.
It's a good game for community as well, and like the Undertale community and fan community is pretty politically active and interesting, and it's part of it's sort of energized a whole community of people to think about games and politics as well. I think a game like that.
Yeah, and you were talking about indie games, and I completely agree with you. A game, for example, have you played or heard of Unraveled? I think
Mm,
it's called Unraveled. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a Ubisoft game.
you can play that Unravel too. Yeah.
Yeah, and that draws on the influence of sort of interdependence and
Mm,
liberal interdependence and cooperating with people or someone else to accomplish things, right? And
yeah.
that's political, and you can see that in the game, and it's super interesting.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And look, we clearly need to. And I obviously am not the person to say what the perfect model for a fair, ethical society is, or a socialist society, or whatever. But clearly, games provide an opportunity to experiment with ideas, right? New forms of collaboration, new forms of digital trade, new forms of working together. And yeah, there's a scope to think of games as a sort of platform for thinking about the future of society and what might be fun, but also what might be, what might work in terms of
Yeah,
communicating with people, organizing with people, things like that.
and VR plays a big important factor in that, right? Because you can put on this headset and you're immersed in another world, and then you can hopefully technology gets to the place where you'll be able to communicate with other people in VR, and have that sort of new dimension. I think that's super interesting because I was wondering how that related to your work, because if you're more immersed in VR, you're
Mm,
more immersed in the video game. What does that mean? Does that mean you got stronger desires?
yeah. Yeah, it's a
Like,
good question. I
yeah,
mean, broadly, my position is that like games have a greater power. I mean, maybe this is just yeah. I mean, you got yeah, whatever. I'm going to say it. Games have a greater power than films and TV to tell you exactly what to desire, and in some ways exactly what to think because of the level of immersion. And clearly, watching a film, there's a certain critical distance. Okay, I'm sure you could be watching there's not always a critical distance. You might be watching your rom-com and totally absorbed, and my daughter's 5, and I can watch her, watching, some kind of fairly basic cartoon like a Pokemon. We do a lot of Pokemon, and she essentially feels she is Ash or Pikachu or whatever, and so there's not really critical distance. But I think that's brought to another level with games and with immersion, and that you're essentially sort of told to identify with a particular position within this virtual environment. So yeah, of course, if that position is an American soldier fighting bravely against supposed terrorists from the hostile Middle East, that is going to be a different and more immersive experience, ideologically different to watching a movie which has those values. And this is something I think games critics, journalists, and stuff should think about a bit more. That this is not just a story. This is something that you immerse yourself in and experience at the level of sort of feeling. Like it is right, isn't it? I mean, I can do it. I mean, I'm a good example because I could easily sit here and say to you, well, I completely disagree with most of the values of, let's say, Call of Duty. But if I put it on, I'm still like, I'm gonna get him, I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna love it, and I still want it, and I'm
yeah.
the game. I'm at least temporarily, I'm experiencing that like impulse. So yeah, games are and VR brings that to new levels. There are almost like training devices where they teach you how to think and feel. And I think that's not an extreme thing to say. I mean, VR is used in the American military, for example, to train soldiers how to think and feel and act in certain situations. So I think the evidence is staring us in the face if that these are devices which can be used to, use ideology and power to teach us what to think and feel in different contexts and situations, and that's scary, but also potentially an opportunity, right, to do things
Yeah.
good, and interesting.
Yeah,
It's
for example, learning, like you're saying, but learning for an educational level.
yeah, exactly, and it all depends. There's an interesting VR Vice documentary with I think it was directed by Spike Jonze. Is he the director of Her? I don't know, I can't remember now. Anyway, you know, it's interesting, and it's it's pre-Black Lives Matter, but it's a sort of police brutality protest against an instance of police brutality in the US, and it's a VR experience of sort of visiting this protest and feeling part of it. And this is pretty interesting because, you know, you feel more, and you watch speeches and talks with your headset on, and yeah, that's interesting because you can sort of feel the reality of it and empathize in different ways and more significant ways than you would if you just saw that on the BBC News. So I think there's great potential, and that's exciting that could happen in a society where we find it so easy to not have any empathy with others. You know, that could help there. On the other hand, it becomes dangerous when, you know, if we just let CNN or Fox News, for example, have all that. And this is the thing with VR, like, it is still quite corporate because it's expensive. So we're more likely to see huge corporations. There is a CNN News VR. Clearly, if you watch CNN News VR, it's going to use those powers of immersion, but to get you to agree with the CNN brand and the kind of ideology they would support. So, yeah, it's one of these tricky things. Like I think, yeah, and I think it's a great opportunity for thinking about how we could use these technologies to do good. But there's also this worry that actually the people in charge of these technologies are quite a small group of people with enormous power who would have it in their best interest to make us think and feel things that they want us to think and feel.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. It's a tool that hasn't been, it's being used, but it's not widely out there, and it's not in the mainstream public as such. And you know, if I'm going to like a shopping center and I see like a VR booth, it's sort of that, oh look, that's a new toy, I want to give it a go, and it's sort of a novelty. And I think a lot of people see it as that. And I was slightly disappointed when the PlayStation VR. I don't know if you've tried that. I haven't actually managed to get my hands on it.
I got that when it came out because I was excited about it. I loved Until Dawn, Rush of Blood. It's sort of a horror simulator.
Yeah. Oh gosh, no.
I loved it. I eventually sort of stopped using it and ended up getting rid of it on eBay because it's very expensive.
It came with like a big block, didn't it? It made it kind of a bit unwieldy. Like you put it on your head, but it's not like the Oculus. It had all of these wires attached, and it was kind of a bit difficult to use.
And it was just, I mean, I think for me as well, I like, it's an odd one. I don't do much multiplayer gaming, but I do like the social aspect of gaming, or I do it in the background. So I like to sort of talk to, you know, friends or my family that are in the room about it as we're going. Whereas the VR headset is so, it just takes you out completely of your sort of social real environment into this other world. And that was what felt boring. Like I couldn't have a conversation at the same time. So it wasn't as compelling as just going back to a normal thing of gaming. But yeah, I guess the thing that's really interesting for me with VR is this desire question. And, you know, this is, I mean, I think that those kind of corporations that I was just talking about, they are interested in using the games to transform how we desire and think. And I guess I haven't really answered this, and you've mentioned that as part of my work, so I'll try and do it. And I mean, the one kind of story that I always tell to kind of illustrate this point is, like, I use it like all the time. So, but you know, I haven't said it to you, so I'm saying it again. But I was in Hong Kong doing some research on sort of gamification of smart cities. I gave this talk about WeChat being quite evil. And at the end of this talk, a couple of people sort of approached me and said, and I was thinking, oh, bloody hell, I'm going to get in trouble. And these guys are from Alibaba, so I'm thinking, oh, God.
Oh, no. They're right in the corporate government structure, aren't they?
But anyway, I wasn't right. They said, oh, you hate Tencent, so you probably love Alibaba. I was like, no, you're both evil. That's not how it works. Anyway, they offered to take me to Alibaba's Cloud Town, which is this kind of Silicon Valley style sort of hub that they got out there in Hangzhou in East China. And, you know, I was asking them, what do you think is the most interesting piece of sort of new technology that you're developing? And what they showed me is a couple of years old now. I don't know how many of these are rolling around the streets of Hangzhou, but it's a car co-manufactured with Rover, the car company. And, you know, I said, you know, I was like saying, what's the most impressive thing about this car? And I was expecting them to say it's fast or it's safe or it's self-driving or whatever. And they said, no, it knows when you're hungry before you know when you're hungry. And it offers you a food suggestion of where you might like to go, and it gives you credits when you complete these kind of go and eat in the right place. And I was sort of, I said, why does that matter? Like, surely that doesn't matter. And they were saying basically, we don't want people to use WeChat Pay or cash. We want people to use Alipay. So what we're doing basically is we're using technologies of gaming to predict what people want and then gradually edit what people want to suit our kind of particular corporate agenda at Alibaba. And I think that that story in itself is scary, but it's also a kind of metaphor or embodiment of what's going on here. Like, our lives are becoming much more gamified than ever. You know, our dating apps are gamified, our shopping is gamified, like everything. Gaming technologies are extending way out of games, and the problem we have at the moment is that the people producing these technologies are interested in very particular things, right? Influencing how we think and feel and what we want and what we do, but to suit their own agendas. And my view is that that's exciting in a way because it shows how powerful games are, and it shows what potential there is to do different things with them. But at the moment, I'd probably still say it's quite a depressing situation because those in power in these industries are not using them to do interesting, positive, progressive things, but to affect us at the level of desire and encourage us to behave like they would like us to behave.
That's interesting because I've been to China as well, and I remember we were at, like, it was me and my friend who's giving me a tour of was it Chongqing? Yeah, we were in Chongqing. And give me a tour of Chongqing. We travel a lot across China, but we first started in that province. What happened was we were sitting down with dinner, and there was maybe like 5 or 6 of us, and they all got out their phones and it all started playing PUBG, right? And I was thinking to myself, like, okay, this is interesting because in the UK or the States or in Europe, most of the Western world, like these games wouldn't be constrained and they wouldn't be restricted. I was like, how is it possible that in China, in this authoritarian state, you've got all of these young people playing PUBG like this? It doesn't make sense. And then I done some research into it, and I realized that PUBG eventually got taken down and replaced by another version of the game that was sort of like you were saying, it was changed towards what the state wanted or what a certain company wanted, and that's really interesting, right? And so, like you're saying, you have that gamification, and
Yeah.
it was just literally was just at face value of what I saw, and it kind of took me aback a bit. Right? It really did.
Absolutely. And I mean, Pokemon Go is another example of my
Yeah.
examples, and it's because AR gaming has great radical potential to transform how we see our city space and transform how we relate to space and do really interesting things. But you know, the biggest games are those like Pokemon Go, and I love Pokemon Go. I mean, I'm still going on Pokemon Go, you know. So you
I
know.
gave up. I gave up on it. It just, the thing is that I think it came out when I was maybe about 14, 15. And at that point, it didn't have any sort of 4G or 3G, just normal Wi-Fi, because I couldn't afford to pay like the contracts and like the gigabyte bundles. And so I just used to go on the bus and try and catch them on the bus using the bus Wi-Fi. You know what I mean? It's kind of funny, but kind of gave up on
Yeah, I've tried it on the bus. It doesn't really work because the bus is.
that.
But you know, I mean, I've written about this a lot of times, and again, it's kind of old news now. But they had deals with various companies, and in Hong Kong, for example, they put the Porygon in the first generation was the rarest Pokemon, and that was only available in some of the more expensive shopping malls, and you know, deals with McDonald's for Pokestops and things like that. It's just a good example of a game which shows you how embedded in wider practices of capitalism these gamified experiences of the city are. So, you know, yeah, another example like AR gaming, you know, location-based gaming, fantastic opportunity to do interesting things. But, you know, if these games are only developed by companies like Niantic, which was a subsidiary of Google, of course, they're just going to serve the purposes that Google want them to serve. You know, we need to sort of wrest a bit of that power back, I think, and start. And this is another to back up the earlier argument we made about indie gaming. This is another reason why indie rather than corporate gaming is the way forward, because it wrests a bit of that power back from those corporations who dominate the industry and gives it back to people who can actually make the games they want to make.
Definitely. And with Pokemon Go, it's the fact that it was so widespread and everyone wanted to play this game, even my neighbors.
Oh yeah,
I'm a big Pokemon fan, and for me as a child, as a teenager, Pokemon was seen as that sort of nerdy thing, right? But when
yeah.
I stepped out my door and my neighbor said to me, "Oh, are you playing Pokemon Go?" or whatever my neighbor said, I was like, "Wow, this is mad. This doesn't make sense. How come everyone's playing this game that I was considered nerdy for?"
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess it did have some quite interesting. What are those? What's it called? Side effects. Where it produced all these really weird encounters and really weird uses of space. That because I think in some ways it was obviously Google slash Niantic thinking, okay, let's try and organize people exactly how we'd want them to be organized. But then there was this kind of mad. Strange kind of side effects of that, of just this kind of mad Pokemon. And you probably talk to people. I certainly did. I talked to people through Pokemon Go that I would never have talked to otherwise. So it does kind of, in some ways, I would say, it accidentally threw apart a lot of the established social networks and created a side effect of new connections between people across different boundaries, whether that's class, gender, race, and so on. So I think there are redeeming features of the Pokemon Go effects, but they were unintentional ones, not what Google was trying to get to happen.
Yeah, and you've also got the unintentional, just people turning up at random shops and trying to catch that, I don't know,
Yeah.
Mewtwo or whatever. You know what I mean?
I met some amazing people in Shenzhen, in near Hong Kong in China, where basically they couldn't do it, so they were spoofing their GPS, and then basically, so they were running around Shenzhen using a map of New York or something, and climbing over buildings and doing some really mad stuff, because obviously the game thinks they're in, because Pokemon Go was banned there, so the game thinks they're in New York, but they're actually in Shenzhen, and it's just like this is chaos, but also really interesting, almost like hacker culture, and
Yeah,
so there are great stuff going on, and the games community is really fascinating. It's full of intelligent, interesting people who are, I think it's important, they're technologically savvy. They know how to use technology. They know how to socialize, how to build communities, and politically, this is important and exciting. And the game, even if our games are made mostly by people with agendas we wouldn't agree with, there's still great potential in the community of gamers to organize and build new communities and do interesting political things.
definitely. Yeah, and like you're saying, indie games should be supported. I'm seeing a lot of the console developers and the main publishers supporting these smaller titles. I remember the PS4 when it first came out, then it had a whole load of indie titles on its PlayStation Store. That was kind of unheard of at that time. A lot of people looked at that and was like, well, what are these smaller titles? It's just cluttering up. It's cluttering up the store. But now people realize the benefit that these games have, and
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
connecting to these stories.
That's a great point. And maybe now is, in fact, the time for somebody to try and develop a console which can only play those kind of things, doesn't need the graphics capacity of those AAA games. And maybe that console could be developed more ethically and more fairly than a PlayStation 5 is. And I would say a lot of people would go for that. I think a lot of people, not just for political reasons, but because it's a lot of those AAA games are so disappointing now. And look what happens with something like Cyberpunk. It's there's so much more fascinating games to be played in the indie game world than there is in these kind of big games these days.
Cyberpunk was, yeah, disappointing. I didn't manage to play it, but I saw that all of the
Mm.
the criticism surrounding it. It was, I mean, I can't say it's not expected because the hype was very real for that.
Yeah,
And I don't think it would ever have lived up to it. But at the same time, when it's broken, that's a big problem. And
yeah, 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 sure.
but I didn't answer your previous question about the PS5. I don't have a PS5. I don't think I'm going to get one, but I do have a Series S, which is the smaller Xbox.
Yeah,
And the reason why I got that is because I didn't really care about those graphics, and
mm,
it was much cheaper than the other two consoles. And but I think the thing is that a lot of people like to have that shiny new thing, and it, and I'm not sure how you break out of that mentality because everyone wants to be that guy or gal or just someone with that piece of hardware that you can show off.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. No, I don't know, obviously, because that's a long-standing thing, as you said, and it's not just hardware. It's, you know, it's commodity. It's what Marx calls commodity fetishism. It's a pair of new Nike trainers, a shiny PlayStation 5, an iPhone, whatever we're on now. But in the gaming community, anyway, maybe it's just because they are, and we are still interested in, you know, there's nostalgia and there's retro gaming, but you know, there's plenty of sort of sections of the gaming community who find a Dreamcast, for example, a much more pleasurable sort of fetish object than they do a PS5. So maybe we can make it more desirable and cooler to have a console which is more stripped back and less sort of shiny, even, and that could actually become the object of desire. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be super interesting to see that.
Yeah.
Definitely. But yeah, I'll say, you know, Ubisoft, if you want to let me in one of your games, or I can do a voiceover.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to do, and yeah, you should get Jack on with his podcast on in the back in like one of your GTA 6 channels or something.
This is what the podcast is all about. This is my whole plan. I want to get in one of your games. Let's go.
Yeah.
I finally wanted to ask you about talk politics in general and how video games in the real world, how politicians can improve the industry. You're seeing this with, I don't know if you've seen the recent developments in terms of scalping and the politicians, the SNP, it was maybe 8 MPs put together a sort of an early motion bill for banning scalpers, and then this is now taken prominence in the Houses of Parliament to try and get this bill debated. Clearly, there you're seeing sort of politicians putting actions, delivering actions that are benefiting the gaming community, and it's showing how politics can impact gaming in a positive way. Are you seeing this too? It's more of a trend, so politics is impacting in real life examples gaming?
Yeah, no, I think okay. I suppose my answer is absolutely we need political reform to pay more attention, not just to the games industry, but to tech companies in general, and you know, so much power, as you've seen through all these kind of Facebook scandals and Zuckerberg in front of the Senate and so on. We've seen quite clearly that, you know, too much power is transferred from the state to these tech corporations, and obviously the practices that are in place there need regulation, and so we should encourage that, and yes, we absolutely need you know, political reform to support the developments of the industry and to help make that fairer and to help make it work. But also at the same time, I think that you know, video games can be political without being part of politics, and that there are sort of ways we you know, there's kind of politics with a big P, where it's something to do with the politicians, or there's just things that are political because they're part of political life and social life. And I think that, you know, that there's two separate things. Yes, we need politics to get involved in these industries and help shape them in a better and fairer way for the future. Of course we do. But for now, I think also we still need to see gaming and its communities as a space which is sometimes outside of that kind of politics, that can offer ways of thinking that you know, would never even be entertained within official you know, political discourses. So you know, yeah, I think that those are good things. We probably need to welcome those kind of things, but that there's also potential for games to shape politics, I suppose, is what I'm saying, rather than politics to shape games. And both those things could happen at the same time, I think, and that's what we should aim for. We should aim to, where we can, lobby for fairer and better, not just politics, but laws as well, regulations, things like that, and unionizing as well. There's obviously games industries have very recently begun to properly unionize. I think that's very positive, that kind of way in which we can affect the industry with political change. And at the same time, we can use games to take part in debates and political discourse, which might actually go the other way as well, where games start influencing political things rather than politics just influencing games.
Yeah, I mean, example of that is crunch. We mentioned this on the previous episode about how there's significant amount of crunch, for example, for Cyberpunk, and how the developers need a platform, for example, a union, to get together to
I mean, that thing about the in-game rewards there was amazing, because it was that something like the workers were being the testers were being sort of in some way getting better working conditions because they were going to be paid regardless of what they said about the game and so on, but then they were being offered all these bizarre like in-game rewards, like, so you've actually got this kind of workplace which is being gamified, building a game, and you can just see that this is a mess. This is not fair or anything. This is a kind of these are exactly the kind of things that and I think, I mean, probably the Cyberpunk thing, it's been well talked about outside of what we could say, but it is an example which just shows how much we need to sort of rethink the whole industry and how it functions, really.
Definitely, yeah, I completely agree with you. On the final point, I just want to say that I looking through some of your research, Alfie. It's giving me dissertation ideas. So thank you very much.
Are you studying something where are you studying?
I study international relations at University of Essex.
Mm.
Oh, sorry, politics, masters at University of Essex. I study international relations undergrad at Essex University. So that's where I'm currently at. So yeah, I've got a dissertation coming up. So your research is giving me ideas, because originally I was going to do it on how politics, or how games might be becoming a political platform. Because that's super interesting, how politicians are using games, for example Twitch, to kind of connect with their voters. But having read your research, having read your research, it's super interesting. So thank you for that. You've given me great ideas.
That's great to hear, and it's been lovely to come on and talk to you. I really support what you're doing with this podcast. Good luck with everything. It's been really fun to chat.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.